Hello, friends. I'm Laverne Friesen, and this is True Emotion Dad, the show where we dive deep into real life stories, healing journeys, and the powerful lessons we've learned along the way. We explore all aspects of mental health, trauma, healing, and spirituality, but we don't shy away from the darker sides of our experiences. By sharing the raw and unfiltered truth, we aim to educate, inspire, and sometimes even offer a cautionary tale. I'm so glad you're joining me as we navigate this wild ride called life. Let's get into it. Today, I am sharing stories that made me realize there must be a higher power, that there must be a God, something much bigger than us, controlling what happens within the universe. These are some of my all-time favorite experiences from my life and my career. And to expand on my belief of God, when I was in my 20s, I had been conditioned to believe that there was a religious God, a very strict and punitive God. But I didn't actually believe it. I didn't know that there was something more. It was just my conditioning. And growing up in a strict fundamentalist religion, of course I was conditioned. But the real beauty happens when we see something for ourselves. When we not only believe it, but we know it. As a young adult and in my late teens, I was quite disgruntled with my upbringing and my community of origin. And as soon as I could, I headed off to the big city from the small farm I was raised on. And I began to work towards a career in law enforcement. And if you remember from my introduction episode, I had been living a lie my whole life. And now I wasn't. Now I was openly pursuing a career in law enforcement. I was oblivious to my childhood trauma and oblivious that that trauma would come back to rear its ugly head if I didn't deal with it. I was on a collision course with a mental health crisis. On top of that, this childhood trauma had created a people pleaser, someone who was easily taken advantage of. And my body's ability to handle stress was greatly reduced because of my childhood experiences. Eventually, I began working security in a large hospital. It was the only trauma center for a very large metropolitan area, as well as a much bigger geographical area as well. Emotionally undeveloped, I embraced all the excitement that I experienced, unaware that I was witnessing traumatic events and experiencing trauma. Over time, I soon got to know who the frequent flyers in the hospital were, or in the hospital system, whether they were unhoused individuals, mental health patients, whatever you might have. And I soon got to know or know of a young girl close to my own age. And she often came to the hospital I was working at for suicidal ideations. She was always very easy to deal with. She was always very cooperative. And looking back, she just wanted help. And I do remember that her mom was difficult. And, and I can't really get into specifics, but I remember that perception. One night while I was working in the emergency room, I watched the paramedics bring a patient in, and they were working on this patient, and I could tell that it was serious, and they headed straight to the trauma room. A few minutes later, my partner came back and he said, "Hey, that was this young girl. She died. She died from suicide at her mom's place." And that event was impactful because she was young, she'd always been very cooperative, and now it was too late to get help. I often thought about that over the years. Several years later, I was working at a hospital on the other side of the city, and I was now the shift supervisor. One night, I went down to the emergency room and I was acquainting myself with what was happening in the area. And we used to often have to watch mental health patients that were being held against their will. And the staff in the emergency room informed me that this one man was there. He was with a friend. He was very cooperative, didn't need to be watched. And they told a story of how this man's younger sister had died from suicide several years earlier and had been taken to a different hospital. This man's complaint was that his mom was overbearing. He couldn't deal with his mom anymore, and his sister had been unable to deal with his mom. And he shared some experiences of his mom's behavior, which I would consider stalking. As these security officers were telling me this story, I was struck by it. And I wondered if it could possibly be the brother to that young girl I had seen wheeled into the trauma center years earlier. Knowing that I had to pursue answers to my question, I perused this man's chart. I found his name, found his mom's name, and I went back to the security office and I began conducting searches. And I soon found this young girl reports from our encounters with her, and I realized that they had the same last name. And when I checked further, the next of kin was the same person. And I was blown away. I went back to the emergency room and I spoke to the nursing staff, the nurse for that area, and I told her the story. And she said, "You have to tell the doctor." I relayed the experience to the doctor and what I'd found. And he looks at the nurse and he says, "Has anyone spoken to the mom?" Which she hadn't. She didn't even know her son was there. And so he instructed the nurse to phone mom and ask her to come in so they could talk to her about her son. And she came willingly. I wasn't there when she came in. But when I came back for my next shift, I asked the shift that had replaced me what had happened. And they said, "Well, there was nothing wrong with that young man. They discharged him." The mother, however, was admitted to the hospital on an involuntary hold. She had an undiagnosed mental illness. And When I ponder the plight of that family, especially with the knowledge that I have now from the experiences I've had in my life, I am dismayed at how easy it is for us to believe the narrative of an abusive individual. Had medical staff had the knowledge and the experience to give credence to this young lady, maybe she would still be with us. Too often we listen to the person with the polished story. We allow the charisma or even the aggressiveness of them to override our gut feelings. It's time that we all learned to trust what our body's telling us. When I think back and think of that man, I wonder often how he's doing now. I imagine that he has a family that loves him and whom he loves. I hope he's successful. I feel that he probably is. With universal or God's intervention like that, I feel like there's no way to go but up. And as illogical as it might seem, I believe that we will meet again one day. But only time will tell. I guess if the universe wants it to, it'll happen. Another example of a synchronicity that took several years to process. And on a very similar timeline. While I was working at the trauma center, that trauma hospital, the same hospital that I was working at, we had a medical flight come in. And part of our duties was to secure the area for the staff from the helicopter to wheel the patient into the emergency room. And I was tasked with this. I blocked off the area and watched as they wheeled this patient in. As we often did, we would follow them into the trauma room and just see what was happening out of curiosity. For many of us, we were working towards a career as first responders, and most of us had a curiosity around all things emergencies. So it was not unusual. I walked into the trauma room and I was shocked to see staff performing CPR on a young child. And although I didn't have the emotional capacity to watch that, nor did I want to, in the few seconds that I walked by, and as I immediately decided to leave, I noticed some things. I noticed that the all-female staff in that room, most of them were crying. And I knew most of them. And most of them were mothers. But something else that struck me was the person that was performing CPR, that was not their role. They were just trying to help in any way they could. And that incident stuck with me for many years. Within hours, possibly even minutes, we all heard the tragic news of what happened. Some young boys had been playing near some water, and they had fallen into the water, and 2 of the 3 boys had drowned. And our city had a children's hospital, but they were overwhelmed with 2 patients So they flew the third patient to the adult trauma hospital that I was working at. We normally didn't get children at our hospital. Once again, approximately 6 years later, working at another hospital on the other side of the city, I had an encounter. And at that time, I smoked cigarettes, and the hospitals didn't allow smoking on hospital property. So I had to walk over to the sidewalk to have a cigarette. One morning around 2 to 3 in the morning, it was in the middle of the night, regardless of the time, I couldn't find anybody to have a cigarette with, so I walked over to the sidewalk by myself. And while I was standing there smoking, there was a lady off to the side having a cigarette as well. And so we struck up a conversation and we started chatting about all things healthcare, how busy the emergency room was that night. And she mentioned that she had the utmost respect for healthcare staff, but she went on to say it hadn't always been a positive experience. And then she went on to tell me how her child had died. He had drowned while playing with some other boys. And as she told me this story, she mentioned how she hadn't got to see her son because as soon as she heard that something had happened, she raced to the children's hospital. And when she got to the children's hospital, she was told that her son had been taken to the adult hospital, which was another 20-minute drive for her. And when she got there, she said that her son was dead. And she didn't have a chance to be with her boy. And as she talked, I was silenced. And I knew who her son was. And I realized that I needed to share what I had witnessed. And so I told her that I'd been working that day. And it was a day that I would never forget. I told her how I had walked back to the trauma room and how I had seen her son lying on the stretcher and how hard those staff members who were moms were working to save a child they didn't know. And I told her how all hands were on deck and how they were crying. As I told her that story, I could feel her relief. I could feel that she was getting closure and that she knew her son had not been alone and that she knew they had tried everything to save his life. The odds of us meeting on that sidewalk 6 years later at 3 in the morning are astronomical. Unless you factor in the possibility of a higher power. I don't know what she was going through at that time, but I know that it was divine timing that we met that night. When I witnessed her son's visit to the emergency room, I was 20 years old. And when I met her, I was 26. I recently wrote a manuscript sharing experiences from my lifetime that I believe prove there is a higher power, a God, something controlling everything in the universe, that we're all interconnected. And when I wrote this last story, as I wrote the last paragraph, I could hear my son in the room next to me playing games. And he was the exact age as her son was when he died. And I pulled back from my computer and I cried. I realized then that maybe I needed some healing too. And maybe me being there in those places at those times was not just for her, but it was for me too. I hope that mom and her family are doing well. She is someone I would like to meet again one day and get her take on our interaction that night. As a parent now myself, and much more emotionally mature, and having done a lot of healing and much closer to my emotions, that would be a fascinating conversation for me. And I know for a fact that I would cry if that meeting is to happen. I am confident that the universe will arrange it if it's meant to be. And if it's not, I'm not holding my breath. I have always found gratitude for those events. I am grateful to the universe, to God, to source energy, whatever you call it, for choosing me to be a messenger of hope and healing. These encounters and others like them signify to me that there is a higher power. How can you explain these so-called random encounters otherwise? Life and this universe we live in is amazing. So sit down, buckle up, and enjoy the ride. And don't forget to listen, to learn, and to love. As always, much love, Laverne.